Robert II, the 2nd of March 1316 to the 19th of April 1390, reigned as King of Scots from 1371 to his death as the first monarch of the House of Stewart. He was the son of Walter Stewart, 6th High Steward of Scotland, and of Marjorie Bruce, daughter of the Scottish King Robert the Bruce by his first wife Isabella of Mar. Edward Bruce, younger brother of Robert the Bruce, was named heir to the throne, but he died without legitimate children on 3 December 1318 in a battle near Dundalk in Ireland. Marjorie by this time had died in a riding accident, probably in 1317. Parliament decreed her infant son, Robert Stewart, as heir presumptive, but this lapsed on 5 March 1324 on the birth of a son, David, to King Robert and his second wife, Elizabeth de Burgh. Robert Stewart inherited the title of High Steward of Scotland on his father's death on 9 April 1326, and a parliament held in July 1326 confirmed the young Stewart as heir should Prince David die without a successor. In 1329 King Robert I died and the 6-year-old David succeeded to the throne with Sir Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, appointed Guardian of Scotland. Edward Balliol, son of King John Balliol, assisted by the English and Scottish nobles disinherited by Robert I, invaded Scotland, inflicting heavy defeat on the Bruce party on the 11th of August 1332 at Duplin Moor and Halidon Hill on the 19th of July 1333. Robert fought at Halidon, where his uncle and former guardian, Sir James Stewart, was killed. Following this battle, Robert's lands in the west were given by Balliol to his supporter David Strathbogie, the titular Earl of Atholl. Robert took refuge in the fortress of Dumbarton Castle in the Clyde estuary to join his uncle, King David. In May 1334 David escaped to France, leaving Robert and John Randolph, 3rd Earl of Moray, as joint guardians of the kingdom. Robert succeeded in regaining his lands, but following Randolph's capture by the English in July 1335, his possessions were once again targeted by the forces of Balliol and King Edward III of England. This may have persuaded Robert to submit to Balliol and the English king, and may explain his removal as guardian by September 1335. The guardianship transferred to Sir Andrew Murray of Bothwell, but following his death in 1338, Robert was reappointed and retained the office until King David returned from France in June 1341. Robert accompanied David into battle at Neville's Cross on 17 October 1346, but he and Patrick Dunbar, Earl of March, escaped or fled the field, and David was taken prisoner. In October 1357, the king was ransomed for 100,000 marks to be paid in installments over 10 years. Robert married Elizabeth Muir around 1348, legitimizing his 4 sons and 5 daughters. His subsequent marriage to Euphemia de Ross in 1355 produced 2 sons and 2 surviving daughters, and provided the basis of a future dispute regarding the line of succession. Robert joined a rebellion against David in 1363 but submitted to him following a threat to his right of succession. In 1364, David presented a proposal to Parliament that would cancel the remaining ransom debt if it was agreed that a Plantagenet heir would inherit the Scottish throne should he die without issue. This was rejected, and Robert succeeded to the throne at the age of 55 following David's unexpected death in 1371. England still controlled large sectors in the Lothians and in the border country, so King Robert allowed his southern earls to engage in actions in the English zones to regain their territories, halted trade with England and renewed treaties with France. By 1384, the Scots had retaken most of the occupied lands. But following the commencement of Anglo-French peace talks, Robert was reluctant to commit Scotland to all-out war and obtained Scotland's inclusion in the peace treaty. Robert's peace strategy was a factor in the virtual coup in 1384 when he lost control of the country, first to his eldest son, John, Earl of Carrick, afterwards King Robert III, and then from 1388 to John's younger brother, Robert, Earl of Fife, afterwards the first Duke of Albany. Robert II died in Dundalk Castle in 1390 and was buried at Scone Abbey. Heir presumptive, Robert Stewart, born in 1316, was the only child of Walter Stewart, High Steward of Scotland, and King Robert I's daughter Marjorie Bruce, who died probably in 1317 following a riding accident. He had the upbringing of a Gaelic noble on the Stewart lands in Bute, Clydeside, and in Renfrew. In 1315 Parliament removed Marjorie's right as heir to her father in favour of her uncle, Edward Bruce. Edward was killed at the Battle of Forat, near Dundalk on 14 October 1318, resulting in a hastily arranged parliament in December to enact a new entail naming Marjorie's son, Robert, as heir should the king die without a successor. The birth of a son, afterwards David II, to King Robert on 5 March 1324 cancelled Robert Stewart's position as heir presumptive. But a parliament at Cambuskenneth in July 1326 restored him in the line of succession should David die without an heir. This reinstatement of his status was accompanied by the gift of lands in Argyll, Roxburghshire and the Lothians. High Steward of Scotland. Renewed war for independence. The First War of Independence began in the reign of King John Balliol. His short reign was bedevilled by Edward I's insistence on his overlordship of Scotland. The Scottish leadership concluded that only war could release the country from the English kings. Continued weakening of Balliol's sovereignty and so finalised a treaty of reciprocal assistance with France in October 1295. The Scots forayed into England in March 1296. This incursion together with the French treaty angered the English king and provoked an invasion of Scotland, taking Berwick on 30 March before defeating the Scots army at Dunbar on 27 April. John Balliol submitted to Edward and resigned the throne to him before being sent to London as a prisoner. Despite this, resistance to the English led by William Wallace and Andrew Murray had emerged in the name of King John Balliol. On their deaths, Robert the Bruce continued to resist the English and eventually succeeded in defeating the forces of Edward II of England and gained the Scottish throne for himself. David Bruce, aged 5, became king on 7 June 1329 on the death of his father Robert. Walter the Steward had died earlier on 9 April 1327, and the orphaned 11-year-old Robert was placed under the guardianship of his uncle, Sir James Stewart of Durrisdeer, who along with Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, and William Lindsay, Archdeacon of St Andrews, were appointed as joint guardians of the kingdom. David's accession kindled a second independence war which threatened Robert's position as heir. In 1332 Edward Balliol, son of the deposed John Balliol, spearheaded an attack on the Bruce sovereignty with the tacit support of King Edward III of England and the explicit endorsement of the disinherited Edward. Balliol's forces delivered heavy defeats on the Bruce supporters at Duplin Moor on 11 August 1332 and again at Halidon Hill on 19 July 1333, at which the 17-year-old Robert participated. Robert's estates were overrun by Balliol, who granted them to David Strathbogie, titular Earl of Athol. But Robert evaded capture and gained protection at Dumbarton Castle where King David was also taking refuge. Very few other strongholds remained in Scottish hands in the winter of 1333. Only the castles of Kildrummie, held by Christian Bruce, elder sister of Robert I and wife of Andrew Murray of Bothwell, Loch Leven, Loch Doon, and Urquhart held out against Balliol forces. In May 1334, the situation looked dire for the House of Bruce, and David II gained safety in France. Robert set about winning back his lands in the west of Scotland. Strathbogie came over to the Bruce interest after disagreements with his fellow disinherited, but his fierce opposition to Randolph came to a head at a parliament held at Daresey Castle in early 1335 when Strathbogie received the support of Robert. Strathbogie once again changed sides and submitted to the English king in August and was made Warden of Scotland. It seems that Strathbogie may also have persuaded Robert to submit to Edward and Balliol. So Thomas Gray, in his Scala Chronica, claimed that he had actually done so, and may explain his removal as guardian around this time. The Bruce resistance to Balliol may have been verging on collapse in 1335, but a turnaround in its fortunes began with the appearance of Sir Andrew Murray of Bothwell as a potent war leader at the Battle of Colblion. Murray had been captured in 1332, ransomed himself in 1334, and immediately sped north to lay siege to Dundalk Castle in Buchan held by Sir Henry de Beaumont, with the castle falling on 23 December 1334. Murray was appointed guardian at Dunfermline during the winter of 1335-6 while he was besieging Cooper Castle in Fife. He died at his castle in Ork in 1338 and Robert resumed the guardianship. Murray's campaign put an end to any chance of Edward III having full lasting control over the south of Scotland, and Edward's failure in the 6-month siege of Dunbar Castle confirmed this. Balliol lost many of his major supporters to the Bruce side, and the main English garrisons began to fall to the Scots. Cooper in the spring or summer of 1339. Perth taken by Robert also in 1339, and Edinburgh by William, Earl of Douglas in April 1341. John Randolph, released from English custody in a prisoner exchange in 1341, visited David II in Normandy before returning to Scotland. Just as Randolph was a favourite of the king, David II mistrusted Robert Stewart with his powerful positions of heir presumptive and guardian of Scotland. At the beginning of June 1341, the kingdom appeared sufficiently stable to allow the king to return to a land where his nobles, while fighting for the Bruce cause, had considerably increased their own power bases. On 17 October 1346, Robert accompanied David into battle at Neville's Cross, where many Scottish nobles including Randolph died. David II was wounded and captured while Robert and Patrick, Earl of Mar, had apparently fled the field. King David's captivity, with the king now imprisoned in England and Randolph dead, the guardianship once again fell to Robert. In 1347 he took the important step of ensuring the legitimation of his 4 sons. John, Earl of Carrick, the future King Robert III. Walter, Lord of Fife, d. 1362. Robert, the future Duke of Albany, and Alexander, Lord of Badenoch, and future Earl of Buchan, and 6 daughters by petitioning Pope Clement VI to allow a canon law marriage to Elizabeth Muir. Even though an English prisoner, David retained influence in Scotland, and Robert had his guardianship removed by Parliament and given jointly to the Earls of Mar and Ross and the Lord of Douglas. This did not last, and Robert was once again appointed guardian by the Parliament of February 1352. The parole David attended this parliament to present to Robert and the members of the 3 estates the conditions for his release. These contained no ransom demand, but required the Scots to name the English Prince John of Gaunt as heir presumptive. The council rejected these terms, with Robert opposed to a proposal that threatened his right of succession. The king had no option but to return to captivity. The English chronicler Henry Knighton wrote of the event: "The Scots refused to have their king unless he entirely renounced the influence of the English, and similarly refused to submit themselves to them. And they warned him that they would neither ransom him nor allow him to be ransomed unless he pardoned them for all their acts and injuries that they had done, and all the offences that they had committed during the time of captivity. And he should give them security for that, or otherwise they threatened to choose another king to rule them." By 1354, ongoing negotiations for the king's release reached the stage where a proposal of a straight ransom payment of 90,000 marks to be repaid over 9 years, guaranteed by the provision of 20 high-ranking hostages, was agreed. This understanding was destroyed by Robert when he bound the Scots to a French action against the English in 1355. The capture of Berwick together with the presence of the French on English soil jolted Edward III into moving against the Scots. In January 1356, Edward led his forces into the southeast of Scotland and burned Edinburgh and Haddington and much of the Lothians in a campaign that became known as the Burnt Candlemas. After Edward's victory over France in September, the Scots resumed negotiations for David's release, ending in October 1357 with the Treaty of Berwick. Its terms were that in turn for David's freedom, a ransom of 100,000 marks would be paid in annual installments over 10 years. Only the first 2 payments were completed initially and nothing further until 1366. This failure to honor the conditions of the Berwick Treaty allowed Edward to continue to press for a Plantagenet successor to David, terms that were totally rejected by the Scottish Council and probably by Robert himself. This may have been the cause of a brief rebellion in 1363 by Robert and the Earls of Douglas and March. Later French inducements couldn't bring David to their aid and the country remained at peace with England until he unexpectedly died on the 21st of February 1371. King of Scots. Consolidation of Stuart power and personal rule. David was buried at Holyrood Abbey almost immediately, but an armed protest by William, Earl of Douglas, delayed Robert II's coronation until the 26th of March 1371. The reasons for the incident remain unclear but may have involved a dispute regarding Robert's right of succession, or may have been directed against George Dunbar, Earl of March and the Southern Justiciar, Robert Erskine. It was resolved by Robert giving his daughter Isabella in marriage to Douglas's son James, and with Douglas replacing Erskine as Justiciar south of the Forth. Robert's succession did affect some others who held offices from David II. In particular, George Dunbar's brother John Dunbar, the Lord of Fife, who lost his claim on Fife, and Sir Robert Erskine's son, Sir Thomas Erskine, who lost control of Edinburgh Castle. The Stuarts greatly increased their holdings in the west, in Athol, and in the far north. The earldoms of Fife and Menteith went to Robert II's second surviving son Robert. The earldoms of Buchan and Ross, along with the lordship of Badenoch, to his fourth son Alexander, and the earldoms of Strathearn and Caithness to the eldest son of his second marriage, David. King Robert's sons-in-law were John MacDonald, Lord of the Isles, John Dunbar, Earl of Moray, and James, who would become the second Earl of Douglas. Robert's sons John, Earl of Carrick, the king's heir, and Robert, Earl of Fife, were made keepers of the castles of Edinburgh and Stirling respectively, while Alexander, Lord of Badenoch and Ross, and afterwards Earl of Buchan, became the king's justiciar and lieutenant in the north of the kingdom. This build-up of the Stewart family power did not appear to cause resentment among the senior magnates. The king generally did not threaten their territories or local rule, and where titles were transferred to his sons, the individuals affected were usually very well rewarded. This style of kingship was very different from his predecessors. David tried to dominate his nobles, whereas Robert's strategy was to delegate authority to his powerful sons and earls, and this generally worked for the first decade of his reign. Robert II was to have influence over 8 of the 15 earldoms either through his sons directly or by strategic marriages of his daughters to powerful lords. In 1373, Robert ensured the future security of the Stuart dynasty by having Parliament pass entailments regarding the succession.